Our next section is adapting tools and practices for the future, and we're going to be introducing Ariana Koblitz. So as I introduce you, Ariana, feel free to come up to the stage, but I'll read her bio here. Ariana Koblitz is an experienced designer currently at New York Life. In addition to working in the financial services space, building out design practices from scratch, she has worked at startups and conducting design research in design consulting. She loves tackling a broad range of challenges, from applying to become an agent, purchasing new and perhaps confusing insurance products, and figuring out which HIV medication is right for you and sticking with it, discovering a new food app, or trying using a blood dialysis machine. And I've seen the needles for those. Those can be pretty scary. Ariana enjoys working across business functions to bring a company's vision to life and introduce human-centered design practices. Implementation means constant storytelling, collective creative expression, and creating pressure testing. She's a third cultural millennial with work experience designing across 3 continents, making products intuitively relevant, and tackling that elephant in the room, behavior change. Broad as that sounds, a core qualitative design research and early stage product development, a firm belief in empathy-driven process hold it all together. A graduate from Stanford University's multidisciplinary product design program, she revels in adapting tools and methods for the future. So Ariana, if you'd like to come up, and a fun fact that you shared about me is that you also you actually are a martial arts teacher. Is that correct? And which style was it? I forget.
It's Aikido. So it's a Japanese defensive martial art, all about being in the moment, using the tools at hand for whatever your partner might be throwing at you. So lots of crossover to so many of the principles that we apply every day in our work. So let me share my screen and just making sure that everyone can see. Thumbs up, Sean, if you can see.
We're looking good.
All right. So welcome, everyone. Our talk in the next 20-ish minutes is around that. How do we adopt our tools for the future that we want? So I am so grateful for Angela and team for the opportunity to join and be part of the phenomenal lineup today. And it speaks to Angela's commitment to fostering great design and strategy talent, that she's excited to create the space for folks like me, who is still early in my career. As a freelancer, and as Sean so kind of described already, I've had the chance to really bounce around. And my work has me catch when assumptions are leading to solutions that are not serving the community, whether it's in Cambodia or Madison, Wisconsin, or the underserved in New York, or helping businesses see past neat Excel logic in a business case when cross-cultural market assumptions might make or break a launch. And so as I've moved across these different spaces, they've all built on this ability to adapt to the design hat, right? That's going to be most key in a given project. And what that means, right? Easily adapting it in small groups. It hits different when you SWAT team in to a much larger corporate location. And when you're working across functions such as marketing, product, sales, or service. And so for the next half hour-ish, I invite everyone to hop into the Q&A. I'm hoping to make this a fairly participatory session. And whether it's, for panelists, if you want to be in the chat, I'll pull those in so that we can make this as much of a cross-learning opportunity. But broadly, I'm going to take just a moment to set the context. When we say adapting to what are we going to focus on when we talk about tools, and then jumping into the actual tools themselves. So context. I love the theme for this design summit. Metamorphosis is perfect for where we are today and what lies ahead of us. And the thing that I always like to keep in mind is that when it comes to a metaphor of the caterpillar and the butterfly, they're both perfectly optimized for the environment they live in, right? This isn't ooh, we don't want to be a caterpillar and ooh, the butterfly is perfect. It's they're both great for the environments that they live in. And so I know what I want the future, the butterfly, the outcome to be for the world I live in. I want a world where we all thrive. I want to make sure that we still have a world that the majority of our communities can live in, right? And so those are core driving beliefs I have. And what that means for design is that how do we hire better to Angela's point, right? How do we have that diverse talent on the team that reflects the world? How do we make sure that the processes enable catching assumptions and questioning the things that need so that it doesn't become a reactive liability, regulatory, PR-driven oopsie, right? And the iterations once we hit market that prioritize triangulating for a objectively to us, right, like better outcome for society versus pivoting towards wherever maximum profit is. But today in other conversations, we've touched on the ways that it is difficult to achieve these ambitions, right? Good intentions is not enough. And kicking off work streams with reminders or initial ethical principles is not enough. And the inertia is there, right? Because we have these tensions that also come up a lot in conversation. So DEI efforts that come up against perceptions of performance and challenging the sourcing of candidates to some of the keyword and just tech-driven processes, right, that HR departments have to function within. And Nam, you mentioned, right, the idea of design still fighting to prove a place in many organizations. That constant perception of slowing down the train, right, makes it hard to speak up and say, hey, I think there's some additional ways that we can uncover or catch or evaluate, right, the elements of the experience at the very earliest point in the process. And then, as I just mentioned, right, that competing priorities on our outcomes, right? We operate in the capitalist marketplace. I see Jose's online, and he and I have had these discussions as well, right? How do we be less reactive? And so that tension between what we know we want and just the realities of where we are today leads me into this topic's focus, which is the moment we're in a project, that's the chance we have to really prototype what it means to shift towards the outcome, right? And though we do that through the tools and the activities that we facilitate, right? Whether it's within a true kind of designer to designer, or when we work with stakeholders and partner groups that are a little bit newer to this general approach. And so throughout, the next 20 minutes, I am curious to hear about the ways that you've adapted your design tools in today's status quo. And as you work to change it, how do you know when it's working? How do you make sure that you're catching when it's not? So I don't have the answers. I'm excited to share the space to really have a chance to kind of just dig into it a little bit, like explore that messy middle of adapting, which is from a creative perspective, I think that's the fun, right? That's when we really get to play. So tools and practices abound. There are 3 that I've come prepared to talk a little bit more about. So those are personas, workshops, and journey maps and blueprints. But of course, if there are others that are your favorites, I'd love to hear about them in the comments as well. And preferences for where we start. Otherwise, of course, I'll just keep marching through the slide sequence that I have here. And for each of those tools, we're going to take a closer look at what makes the tool powerful, right? What is it that makes people have just these moments of, oh, shit, how have we not had someone like this on our team in all our meetings moving forward? And then the ways that it can mask or fall short of nudging us to do better design. And then a couple ways that I'm committing or trying out to adapt it as I move forward in projects, move from here on out. So I'm not seeing anyone, so that means that I get to choose. And we're going to start with persona, right? So personas embody the rich understanding, hopefully, of those we seek to design for, right? When you have a diverse team come together, it helps for us all to be able to speak from a shared understanding. So you can, even just the act of giving a persona a name and everyone speaking to that, there's a power there, right? It allows to cut through the noise a little bit. And it helps bring to life, right? When we say we're empathy driven, we're end user driven, this is one of the ways that becomes most tangible. That said, when we look at a lot of the templates, right, we're trying to cut through to some universal truths that stakeholders and designers can relate to, right? They can build off of. I remember, there's always a debate between just using kind of like data informed from research versus the space to be inspired and connected to broader themes, right? But at that high level, it's really easy for designers to mask and not even realize, we give everyone the benefit of the doubt, that you're masking, you're projecting your own reactions and your perspectives back into the designs. But now that we've used a persona, it's really easy to make ourselves believe that, that wasn't the case, right? We are truly designing for Lisa here. This is why we made this call, right? To make a feature. And so ways that I've played around with adapting is have multiple personas and make sure that in a given workshop, those personas are different from each other and ideally different from the profiles of the design team members and the stakeholders, which just makes it a little harder, right? To kind of project it. Yeah, I totally believe that that person who makes 15 grand a year, right, is like purchasing the same things that I am. And the other way that that can become really helpful, right, out of constraint, that's what allows us to generate even better ideas, is things like going through round robin of idea generation, where you come up with a set of ideas, you pull in a different persona, and suddenly you press a little bit, right? Like, hey, does this idea still hold as strongly with a persona that is different from the first? And that's kind of akin to the brainstorming activity when we fold a piece of paper into 8 and hand that piece of paper around, right? Each person has to build on the idea that they start to see emerging on the paper. Those things can be really powerful. And then after, right, that initial idea generation phase, I think the chance of incorporating actual real data from the journeys of the consumers, the customers, the clients, the end users of a company can help make those personas real. It can be really easy in a workshop to feel like, you know what, it doesn't even matter, right? Like, it's Lisa, but I know she's not real. But if you bring in some data points about what's actually happening, especially if they help kind of myth bust, and we'll get into myth busting a little bit in our next tool, again, that can just be a powerful inspiration just to keep pushing a little harder. I'm gonna keep moving on, but I encourage everyone to, right, like post your reflections, you do them on social media, maybe you'll win one of Crave's amazing products out of it. But the next tool that I would like to walk through is journey maps and blueprints, right?
Hey, Ariana, I was just wondering real quick, pardon me to interrupt, but the conversation about personas, I think, is really interesting. And I would like to share, and maybe we could just take a minute and kind of just talk through maybe a small exercise with it. So my partner works in financial services, and they're trying to develop a new app that is centered around helping individuals with bad credit. So the practice at this particular company is that they developed a persona, and what they do is they then create a prototype of the app, and they essentially populate the persona's attributes into the app. And so one thing that my partner noticed was very interesting is that, like I said, the goal of this app is to help people with bad credit. Well, guess what? The persona has excellent credit. And so I'm curious, how would you, in terms of that prompt, walk us through maybe a better, more responsible practice for that particular design challenge?
Well, I mean, I think it comes back to who crafted the persona, right? And is that aligned with the objective and the mission of whether this is a new feature, right, and existing. So that's where context is really important, because I've also seen sometimes where, because of examples like that, teams will on the fly before a workshop try to just like very quickly, let's come up with a new persona, right? But if other stakeholders and teams have already worked off of personas for some of these other broader features, right? And then they walk into the session and it looks, in this persona here, just for today, it looks very different. Again, it can be hard to be like, to think that you're committing and you're really thinking through who's using it. Now, if this means that there needs to be a bigger conversation about how did we get to have a persona that has amazing credit when that is not who our actual target audience is, that's a really great way, I think, to open up a conversation with other functions in the company. Hey, who's determining our segmentation? Who's determining who we're pulling in for usability research? Are we sure that we're all thinking about, again, that same person? There's the great analogy of, right, you see that image of all these scientists that are touching different parts of an elephant, and one sees a snake and the other sees a wall and the other sees like this amazing, right, like new kind of manufacturing tool. And of course, no one is stepping back to look at it. I think that can happen sometimes with personas if you have different versions of it that live across those functions.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting for the discussion. I think like, and even just taking that moment, even as a creative professional, to take a step back to think about, again, with kind of what we've been saying in this entire talk, think about why we're doing this and how this is representing what we're talking about. And I think it's a really good, even if you feel very confident in persona building, to, you know, take that second and just make sure, are we measuring something that is going to make sense for us later on?
Yeah, for sure. All right, so I'm gonna maybe go through one more, and then of course also want to be mindful of our time. We're coming on to 3, so Sean is going to be my timekeeper on this. This time it's not on me, so he'll just let me know. So with journey maps, right, what is so powerful there is, and it's still fascinating to me that you can walk into a team who have never seen their relationship to the actual experience reflected on paper. And especially not one that they feel like they can walk through. I've been working with larger corporations that might have a team that do these massive value mapping, right? It looks very kind of user interface architecture style, but those become parts of parts. And so with journey maps, you can myth bust a little bit about, hey, I know we're really tracking and very honed in on a key metric at point B in the process, but to help highlight how actions that happen maybe a month before, maybe only 3 clicks before, are potentially have a much heavier influence, right, than what's actually happening in that one moment when they're either submitting the form or clicking the buy button or not. And of course, I think one of the entry level kind of intros to journey mapping is that mapping of emotions and when are things going well and when is the user frustrated. So to connect those to truly, right, the types of metric outcomes that as a business level, that's what is on their P&L, that can be really powerful. And of course, especially when you pull in elements of blueprinting, right, we've mentioned service design, that moment when teams see their work reflected in terms of the impact that they're having, that's really powerful. I think where it can fall short sometimes is that journey maps are a bear to keep up to date, right? This is the area that I'm most excited about in terms of new SaaS offerings, just because it's hard to go around, document, right? Like empower other people to do those edits. It's just, it's hard. And as a working document, not so much the strategic, beautifully designed outputs that you use maybe in a strategic leadership meeting, but as a working document, it can balloon to having too many considerations. And when we talk about wanting to design for justice and sustainability, I feel like it can sometimes, to other teams and even to us as designers, feel like we're going down this rabbit hole of, oh my gosh, there's just so many different implications in society and on our environment. And we're worried that we're still missing stuff because we have in the past, right? So that can all feel very challenging. For me, the ways that I've adapted it is, one, again, super excited about new products coming to market. I know that Tableau a couple years ago have rolled out integrations with Adobe Illustrator, right? That allows it to pull in data points in real time. That's super exciting. So how do you do that in a way that brings other teams along so that they actually go and look at it? More and more teams are used to going to dashboards, and so that behavior, I think, has become easier. And so then it becomes a strategic question of what are the elements that you really want to pull forward and highlight. It's a great entry level or bringing on new team member action, and so almost creating that as part of our own internal, how are we working as a team? I think there's a lot of power there. And yeah, so those were 2 of them. I have one more. Or if there are other questions, reactions, ways that you in the audience have been changing or adapting your use of journey maps and blueprints, would love to hear all of that.
Ariana, I think why don't we go ahead and take the last couple of minutes to share the last tool. I'm actually kind of excited to see what you'll say about it. So why don't we finish it up with that last little bit of your presentation?
Yeah. No, I know Angela went on camera, so if she has a question for me, I'd love to have that as well. But workshops is a quick one. Workshops are one of the many ways that people are first introduced to the notion of design, design thinking, the approach of human-centered design into business. It brings teams from different corners of a company together, right? Like that's really powerful. And when well facilitated, it generates a buy-in that can really break through a lot of the kind of paralysis, right, that happens when people feel like there's too many decisions to make, and you're not using a normal kind of business case to make those decisions. But what can happen in a workshop, right, is that because you're in the room, and this is, for example, why we get some advertising campaigns where you're like, how did anybody get that a green light? It's because you were in a room, you got excited, and you're talking around, and everyone in that room, right, the logic was clear. So ideas can balloon a lot in a way that can be hard to rein back in, especially if you then have people that are not designers who get excited at the very explicit expression of the idea in a workshop versus the nuggets that are inherent within it, right? The nugget is the thing that you move forward, but oftentimes it ends up becoming that surface skinning of it that a leader becomes just super in love with, right? And your assumptions get baked in a way that can be hard to detangle afterwards. And so for me, I think workshops have become something where it's not about so much that time in the room. It's really about what is the pre-work that we're doing and how can we be more transparent about the post-workshop analysis. So Nam made an amazing reflection, right? That like, hey, a lot of people still don't know how much work, expertise, and skill goes into a lot of the elements of the design work that we do. And a large part of that, I think, is because of this notion of design theater. And some of it's necessary because we need to kind of grease the wheels, help people just kind of move along with it. And you don't have to understand it. I don't understand actuarial tables and I don't need to, right? But I need to somehow get you to trust, right, that there's going to be something really exciting at the end of it. And at the same time, we need to balance that with showing people how taking design principles and applying, right, our understanding of markets and assumptions and the risks, right, that we want to be able to flag, not now and being some kind of a worry nanny, but in a way that can help it from going off the rails a year from now. That's some of the work that at least I've been focusing on more and more. And so, yeah, that's really it. So if there, again, are other tools or there are other questions, just super excited to be here and be hearing from so many others across today.
Ariana, can you guys hear me? Thank you so much for sharing this, the tools that we need to, up level our ability to be the change agents to help companies move through change, right? I have a question for you, just the pandemic, right? Doing some of this work is so much more effective when you are in that same room, watching that human emotional reaction from the different, people from the different departments, right? To connect with them. What's happened now as a result of the pandemic? How's that made it harder? And of course, design, we're accustomed to doing things remotely, but like, what have you noticed?
No, that I am 100% with you. I think that we are human beings. We use all 5 senses, and we can't forget that, right? Even though businesses would like to think that you can, right? And we have absolutely made a lot of money, and they're amazing tools, right? I think for me, what I found is that you break it up in chunks, because the other thing that is much harder is to ask someone to commit multiple hours staring at a webcam, or not having your phone off, and then I'm just yelling into a black void. So it's you break it up into smaller chunks, which on the flip side makes it easier to share out those smaller chunks. And so suddenly the design process becomes a little bit more bite-sized and digestible.
I have a quick tangent comment I just want to make. I love the backdrop, your backdrop, and I remember how every time I've met you, or we meet, your backdrop keeps constantly changing, and it's just fascinating how so many of you creative professionals, everybody's outlet, there's another creative outlet somewhere, and I love it. I know you work, in a massive corporation, at understanding how many people are there now, you know, how many designers, creatives, you know, UX, customer experience, how a company like that has still needs a role like yours to connect design overall, the overarching design department, to connect that to the other parts of the corporation, right? What, I guess, can you shed a light on that a little bit? I know the role and the impact that you make, and I know so many corporations that have invested in design, and their evolution of how they've built design within those corporations, they're at different stages.
And even within a company, different parts of the company will be at different stages, right? So I think what makes
Yes.
interesting is that you get pulled into projects who are at various different stages. You always hope that it's earlier in the process rather than later, but the other element of being an in-house team is that you're really there to build relationships. So you might come in at the 11th hour for one thing, but you're hoping to plant seeds so that whatever it is that you do, you say, hey, you can still launch this thing. I might have some questions. I'm going to be very nice about it, because once you launch, right, what are the ways that we can, right, like build to refine it, right, build towards the next iteration of it.
Yeah. It's interesting because I notice when corporations build a design team, first thing they do is they build a design team, and it's like this beautiful pill, right? But as if when you ingest a pill, it doesn't always like really osmosis doesn't necessarily happen. Sometimes design sits isolated. And so when corporations invest in roles like yours, it really does start to facilitate that design department's impact across the different, divisions of the corporation, right?
Yep.
What are the types of challenges that are different for a department that has never experienced working with design, right? Versus one that works with design but utilizes them. And I don't know if you have an answer for this, but there are some corporations where the design team will tell us the challenges that, like, let's say fashion, where the fashion industry sees design as aesthetic and the back end of the design process. They can't see design moving upstream and being more strategic because their investment with that, it has been so long. Their traditional method of investing in design has been aesthetic, technical, not strategic.
Yeah, so where the challenges is similar is where you plug in, right? So with a team that has never had design be an explicit part, that's that concept of like, hey, you're slowing the train down, right? Whereas and you're slowing it down because there's never been the caboose that is trying to kind of join in, right?
Yeah, right.
You have to figure out how do you create even smaller, right? Like, hey, give me one work session, like even just like one decision that you're thinking of making in the next month, right? And you build from there. With a team that already has design, and the design is implemented and executed in a very specific way, that's where language becomes really key, because you also want to build a really strong relationship with that design team. And sometimes the design team wants to be part of that earlier strategy, and sometimes they don't, right? To the conversation we had around craft, right, where people are like, I'm happy adding that layer. And so language is really important, because we can't be in any way seeming to imply that that is somehow not the right application of design either, right? But that it's different. And so to your comment around candidates all using the same phrase, right? Like, I solve problems, give me any problem, I can solve it, right? Strength of our practice. And that is the difficulty when people hear that and they go, okay, so you all do the same thing. Interesting.
Right. They don't know how to distinguish.
Yeah.
It's interesting because what we're noticing in larger, it's not even that corporations that are larger, but more advanced in how they build investment into the design team, is that they have roles like yours where you're a facilitator, you're a mediator between the design department and the other divisions of the corporation, right? Yeah.
Sometimes you get, I think this is where just org leadership and politics and organization come into play because you're gonna have someone that understands that and has that vision and pulls you in. Like, I have head count, you exist now. That doesn't, the nature
Yeah.
of that function is built in and bought in across the other teams at an enterprise.
I'm curious, do you facilitate conversations obviously between design and other departments like product managers, product teams, or across, to marketing and engineering, but do you ever facilitate using the, our traditional or design methodologies? Do you use these to facilitate conversations across different departments, I don't know, marketing and, engineering or different product categories?
The majority of the projects I end up getting pulled into actually is teams that neither of whom see themselves, right, as creating or designing. And I'm always applying the same set of tools. It's just instead of, and it is an external problem, but the people who are in the work session, right, have different sets of expertise. So Sarah has a great question around how do you create space when you have people in different backgrounds when I am in a workshop. And the answer is like, this is where the pre-work comes into play, figuring out how much work can so that it's not a blank canvas. People are not comfortable adding a post-it note and they're like, I'm me, this is Sharpie, right? And so how do you
Yes.
put something up on the wall where they actually see their work reflected? Like, wait, that's my KPI. Ooh, look, wait, they keep over there, right? Like, why is it over on this end of the journey map, right? Where two teams actually see that they're tracking the same interaction. They just use different metrics for it in their dashboard, right? So if they can see things that they recognize, that gives them that confidence and that control back, right? Because sometimes, especially sometimes when you have consultancies, right, descending, we will do design thinking for the next 3 hours. You leave people with a sense of like, oh, I'm such an idiot that like I didn't know how to put my work together in this different way. And we definitely try to prevent. And I've vendor partners that I've worked with have gotten a lot better at that as well.
Yeah. I love how, design thinking is something that I think it's so valuable as an industry for us to teach our counterparts to understand, but yet obviously when with the right person facilitating this, the quality of the solutions or the insights will, obviously with your, people like you leading this process, the insights are much more granular. I love it.
It's convincing everyone that that's the case, right? That
yes,
the nut to crack at the other end.
Ariana, thank you so much for this.